Welcome to Garden Views. Interesting conversations with interesting people who have done and/or are doing interesting things. So sit back and enjoy.
Welcome everyone to Garden Views, and we are visiting today with one of our return friends, Darius Kamali, of the Persian Version podcast, among other things. And we're going to talk today about the Kurds and some related matters. For those of you who don't know Darius or aren't familiar with him, one, you can go check out the 3 or 4 prior shows where he's been on this show. One is cleverly called the Persian Version. And that is the name of his podcast. And so you can check out his episodes as well. We also did a show on the Iranic relationship between the King Arthur tales and, I guess, Dark Ages Britain and Iranic knights and things like that, and a lot of parallels there. We did one on mythology and legends and lore, and I'm sure somewhere along the line we did another show as well. But without further ado, let's say hello. Hey, Darius, how are you doing today?
How are you, Jeff? It's good to be back.
I'm good. It's good. Yeah, it's great to have you back.
It's been a while.
It has, yeah. And of course, Darius is going to tell you all about his stuff towards the end of the show, and we'll probably fit some in during the course of the show and conversation as well. Now, as you may have guessed, because Darius runs, it does the Persian Version. He also has a Facebook group, which he'll give the name later on, but it focuses on Iranic peoples. The Kurds are an Iranic people, so he has expertise in that. But that it doesn't stop there. He has worked in human rights. He has worked with non-governmental organizations and war crimes tribunals. So, and he's been an international monitor. So let's start there. Darius, tell the folks about your background, I guess, period, and then you can work your way into your background in human rights, intelligence with NGOs, and the war crimes tribunals.
Sure, yeah, it's a mouthful, but it all kind of revolves around one sort of central organization. Yeah, my background in that world, as you know, Jeff, I've also been in film and animation more recently.
Yep.
But this is prior to that. So it's an interesting direction my career took from war crimes tribunals to children's animation. But that happens. In any case, so my background in human rights and private, public, you could say, intelligence and war crimes tribunals involves a few organizations. One of them was called the International Monitor Institute, IMI. And we also worked briefly with Human Rights Watch, HRW, which is a much better known, larger human rights organization to this day, as well as some others like the Simon Wiesenthal Center here in LA, which is related to the Museum of Tolerance,
sure,
run by, at the time it was Rabbi Heyer and Rabbi Cooper. I don't know if they're both there anymore. But the former actually showed up at Trump's inauguration, but I'm not a big Trump fan, but what do they say about politics makes interesting bedfellows.
Right.
So IMI was an NGO or a non-governmental organization that became a sort of semi-governmental organization over time while I was there, in the sense that it began to take government money. And so it sort of changed category. Originally, it had been called before I was there, it was called the Balkan Archive. And it was a visual repository, very specifically about the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia and what happened there in the 90s, particularly after the civil wars and the wars between the former states, Slovenia and Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia, Herzegovina, so on and so forth. And it grew out of that to become something more international. And it was housed, I should say, itself in an otherwise very inconspicuous office tower on the Wilshire corridor here in Westwood. And I think close to the AFCO theaters, and nobody would have known what's going on in there.
Right.
Yeah.
In Los Angeles, California, for those of our international listeners or those who don't care about show business.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I forget that we're not all from LA.
That's right.
So it served many functions, but primarily the most important things that it did was it ended up being the visual evidence wing, you could say, for a number of ad hoc international criminal tribunals, including something called the ICTY, which was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the organization that went on later to try a lot of these war criminals, including probably most famously Radovan Karadzic.
Oh, yeah.
Some year. And also another one called the ICTR, which was the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And the genocide that went on there between the Tutsis and the Hutus. And we also advocated for this at this time. The two that I just mentioned, these are ad hoc tribunals in the sense that they're temporary. They're very task specific. But we advocated for the formation of what became the ICC, which is a permanent international criminal court housed at The Hague. And so we were there sort of at the inception of that. Now, that's become a controversial institution, as all these things end up being, a lot of countries have left it because they claim that, the big powers are using it to go after the little powers, and the big powers themselves still get away with everything. But, that be that as it may, we now have an ICC.
Right. Wasn't Milosevic tried in the ICC?
I think so. Yeah, Karadzic was not. But yeah. And a lot of African countries. Mm-hmm. That was sort of part of the problem. But organizations that we also worked with included the National Security Archive, which sounds like a governmental organization. It's not. It's an NGO that files FOIA requests, mostly is what it does. March Air Force Base, which definitely is governmental. Simon Wiesenthal Center, Southern Poverty Law, ACLU. And a lot of work with, believe it or not, the Red Cross, International Red Cross. And
well, first we say FOIA is Freedom of Information Act, for those who don't know it. So that's asking the government to provide information. Most states, I think every state in the United States and the federal government itself has a Freedom of Information Act. And I imagine most developed countries have some equivalent as well.
That's right. That's exactly what it is, and that's sort of their main function at National Security Archive. So we were basically a repository of visual evidence about everything bad in the world.
Gotcha. Fun.
Yeah, and in fact, I had to view a lot of things that were quite difficult to watch, and the one that I'll mention, even mentioning it is horrific, was a video of a stoning punishment. Ooh. Done by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Very Quranic, old school, biblical. Yeah, so it was difficult stuff to watch. It's one thing to see things in fictional movies because it's fake, but 2 minutes of something real just really affects you a different way.
Right.
But at one point, copies of some of our materials were actually kept in a secure underground vault in a mountain in Utah.
Wow.
Not just ours, but it was, sort of like you could say a storage unit for these sorts of things for a lot of organizations.
Was there a UFO parked next to it? I don't
know.
Okay.
If there was, they didn't tell me.
Right.
But it could very well be.
You were just roommates, so you didn't share like that.
We were just roommates. No, we didn't ask questions of each other.
Gotcha.
And today, of course, the Institute no longer exists, the IMI, but much of its sort of summarized findings are housed at Duke University Archives. Not so much the visuals, but the reports.
Gotcha.
As for funding, I should tell you that when I began there, it was a normal NGO, and it wrote grants, to grant-making foundations to raise money for itself, to such organizations as Ford Foundation, Luce is another big one, and a little more controversially these days, George Soros's Open Society Institute.
Dun dun dun.
So, yeah, so a lot of my right-wing friends will not be happy to hear that, but we did receive money from. It was run by a gentleman named Arya Nair at the time, and they gave us some money. And then after I began working there, we also flew out to D.C. and presented our work to the Department of State. And from that point onward, some governmental organizations, including state, also backed us and gave us, financially.
Right, grants.
What's that?
Grants, right?
Exactly, right, for specific projects. And that's where I say we became more of a semi-governmental organization and no longer a non-governmental organization.
Okay.
Of course, that means I got to see once, that happened, how it is that sort of funding starts to influence an organization, right?
Right.
And I could very clearly see the different direction that we were going, because now your funders can tell you, whether that's government or not, we want you to concentrate on this and don't really worry about that. And I got to see, they don't have to send you to Siberia. They just cut your funding.
Right.
If you don't do as they say.
There's no such thing as free money, even in free money.
No such thing as free money. No free lunch, no breakfast, nothing. So, so I got to experience that firsthand, and that happens to a lot of organizations. They get captured in a sense.
Right. You have a project manager who is maybe more of a project manager than.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, exactly that happened. I won't name names, but yeah, we suddenly had a minder.
Right. There you go.
Yeah. And so anyway, that's the International Monitor Organization. I could tell you a little specifically about what I did there, if you'd like.
Sure. Let's talk about this. We're at some point it's going to take us to. I imagine that one led you to Iraq and the Kurds. Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of became my specialty there. I was brought on board as a visual analyst. I was promoted to senior analyst, basically the same job. Then they made me project manager of the Iraq desk, and that there was only one person on the Iraq desk. That was me. So I project managed myself. And
were you a good boss?
And I was, yeah. And finally, I sort of ended my stint there as archive curator, where my goal was to try to transform the Institute into something even more general or universal, where we would become a visual depository of materials related to global hotspots everywhere, not just the 3 or 4 focus areas that we had prior. We had started off.
Sorry to interrupt, but would that be considered sort of like maybe an internationally recognized custodian of records kind of role?
Yeah, no, that's exactly. I mean, that's what the Institute was, but it was, like I said, it started just with the Balkans, and Rwanda was added to it, and I added Iraq to it. We even had a Cambodia archive, and we tried to. But all that depends on funding too, right?
Of course.
And what the funders want you to concentrate on.
Right.
So that's where the Kurds come into it is that I ran a joint project there alongside Joost Hilterman from HRW, Human Rights Watch. So it was a joint project between IMI and Human Rights Watch, where I was in charge of digitizing, analyzing 50 plus hours of very extremely sensitive footage that had to do with the war crimes and crimes against humanity that were committed against the Kurds and others, but I'll concentrate on the Kurds, by Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist regime in Iraq. And we digitized, analyzed, and made these searchable through a process we developed and called it reverse editing, which just made it very available for attorneys to be able to use. and very graphic stuff. Some of it was interviews, some of it was actually, very graphic and to the point of showing, even moments and episodes of torture. So it was horrific stuff.
Right.
The Ba'athist regime, in case maybe I should say a couple words about that. That was the regime that ruled both Iraq, and there was another Ba'athist regime in Syria, but they were separate from each other. These were, go ahead.
They're political parties, but they're, I guess, roughly or maybe not so roughly also aligned, because aren't they both follow the sort of Sunni Islamic led government parties?
They're actually, the Ba'athist regimes were secular, pan-Arab socialist parties.
Ah, okay.
Or so that, socialism has many definitions. You can go, the Nazis were socialists in a way, right? But
no, they said so.
Yeah, they said so, right? So it was a little bit more like that, very kind of nationalistic. But so they, and keep in mind, this is around the time where a lot of the atrocities against the Kurds happened, that Iraq was fighting Iran. So you have to kind of keep that in as the background here. So the Ba'athist regime committed 2 atrocities against its own people that were later taken up by criminal tribunals after the fall of Saddam. And those were against the so-called marsh Arabs in the south of Iraq, who live in an area called the Marsh. You think of southern Iraq as very dry and desert, but there's a section of it near the Persian Gulf that are marshlands.
Right.
And in fact, some scholars have said that this could be the area that was referred to as the biblical Garden of Eden.
Ooh, so that's the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates and the Persian Gulf.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Right where they meet and basically flow into the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Sure,
though the one end of the Fertile Crescent.
That's exactly right, the southern end. And so the Ba'athist regime and Saddam Hussein, they actually drained most of the marshes and poisoned them.
Huh, lovely.
Yeah. And in the south, and also in the north of Iraq, they went after the Kurds. Now, Why did they go after the Kurds? Because, again, you have to remember, Saddam Hussein was a pan-Arabist. He had attacked Iran, and he saw the Kurds, perhaps rightly, as, because they're not Arabs, they're linguistically, ethnically Iranic, as potentially a fifth column, a disloyal fifth column. And to some extent, there's some truth to that, although not entirely. And so he went after the Marsh Arabs in the south and the Kurds in the north. Now, before we get more into that, let me say a few words about the Kurds. Who the hell are the Kurds? I assume, I know you know and I know, but not everyone knows.
Right.
So the Middle East is an extraordinarily complex, ethnically, linguistically complex area of the world. Both chronologically and geographically, it's been the home of many waves of peoples over the years. And I won't get into the details, we don't have time for that, but the 3 big groups that are still present in the area, these are ethno-linguistic groups, right? That word kind of implies that it's not just ethnicity, it's sometimes just language, right? And so that includes the Semites, which, believe it or not, includes both Arabs and Jews, even though they don't get along politically. Linguistically, they're related. There's the Turkic peoples, who came significantly later by Middle Eastern standards from Central Asia. And there's the Indo-Europeans, which includes the Iranics, the Armenians, Persians, and Kurds. Who, by the way, the Kurds, they themselves trace their lineage back to one of the specific Iranic groups called the Medes. They go back to the time of the Bible. The Persians and the Medes. The Persians and the Medes were always kind of, those 2 words were used next to each other in the Bible continuously. And so if today's, Persians are descendants of the Persians, the Kurds say we're descendants of the Medes.
Gotcha.
And there's some genetic, truth to that, but nevertheless, that's what they say. So Kurds are an Iranic people, and they live all over the Middle East, including in Iran itself, but many of them live as minorities in majority Arab countries like Iraq and Syria, or a majority Turkic country like Turkey.
Right.
And they haven't done well in those countries. They've been seen as minorities and not necessarily treated well. Now, Kurdish itself is a large population. The Kurds today live in Iran, in Iraq, in Syria. A large percentage of Turkey is Kurdish. Some of them even in the Caucasus and Armenia. And there's a huge, what you could call a diaspora population also in Europe, particularly in Germany. So altogether, there are, depending on who you ask and what you read, somewhere between 30 and 45 million Kurdish people around the world. And that's a significant number for what they say is a stateless population.
Right.
Now,
I believe they've been documented as the largest ethnic population that has no state of their own.
I have read that many times. It may be wrong, but that's the claim. And if it's not, it's certainly close.
Okay.
Now, having said that, Kurdish is not one language. Within Kurdish, there are several dialects, and they're not even mutually intelligible necessarily. Yeah. It's three of the big ones are Kurmanji, Sorani, and Zazaki. And not to complicate things too much, but I'll just put this in a parenthesis. A separate group of non-linguistically Kurdish Northwest Iranian languages, the Zaza-Gorgani, are spoken by several million Kurds. So these are ethnic Kurds, but they're not technically speaking the Kurdish version of Iranian. It's complicated, but we'll put that to the side.
It's not that complicated. If you just think about, American Jews that don't speak Hebrew.
There you go. Okay, that's a way of you clarifying. Okay, that's right. That's right. Ethnically, they may be, or culturally, but no longer linguistically.
Right.
The etymology, I looked this up, of Kurd. Apparently, again, none of these things are entirely agreed upon by everyone, but it seems like the etymology goes back to the Middle Persian word qurt, a term for which means nomad or tent dweller.
Ah.
So it's not necessarily a negative term, it's just descriptive. And so it seems that in the Indo-Iranian world, they are sort of like what referred to as the Bedouins would be in the Arab world.
Gotcha.
Right, the ones who are nomadic.
Sure.
And in the case of the Kurds, very much in the mountain dwellers, and we'll get to that later. Zagros mountain area. So these are the Kurds. So why did Saddam Hussein go after the Kurds? It was something called the Anfal campaign. Anfal means spoils of war in the Arabic language. And the Anfal campaign was a series of military operations carried out by the Ba'athist regime in Iraq against the Kurdish people in northern Iraq from 1986 roughly to 1988. And the campaign was led by Saddam Hussein's cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, also known as Chemical Ali.
Right.
Yeah, for his use of chemical weapons against the Kurds, very most famously in Halabja, if you remember, where they gassed that whole village. So the Anfal, by the way, he had been using chemical weapons against the Iranians with whom he was at war, but this was the first time he used it against his own Kurdish population,
right,
which he feared were sympathetic to the Iranians. So the Anfal campaign is considered to be a genocide, and it is estimated that between 100,000 and 200,000 Kurds were killed. It was systematic. It was an attempt to exterminate Kurdish people. The Iraqi forces destroyed villages, they destroyed crops, they killed all the livestock. They used chemical weapons such as mustard gas, sarin, against Kurdish civilians. The men were often separated from the women and children, executed. Women and children were either killed or taken to prison camps. The Anfal campaign was sort of a horrific crime against humanity, and it's left a lasting legacy of suffering for Kurds even today, who are not that far removed from it.
Sure.
Now,
so it's only 3 decades ago.
Yeah, that's right. And it's certainly far from the only pogrom, you could say, against them, but it was one of the most kind of intense. And so the Kurds in Iraq particularly are still struggling to rebuild their lives and their territory. I'll also mention a couple of words that people often hear. Peshmerga became sort of famous during the U.S. occupation of Iraq. The Peshmerga were a Kurdish resistance unit.
Right.
And they fought during the invasion of Iraq, and they fought against Saddam. They're basically Kurdish nationalists, right? And they fought against this pogrom, against this Anfal campaign, just with various degrees of success. And then there were the Josh forces, Jaash, who were the collaborators. And, when in all these situations, just like in World War II, you had French collaborators with the Nazi invaders, so on and so forth.
Right.
So the campaign was sort of run by the man I mentioned before, Ali Hassan al-Majid, Chemical Ali, who was the head of an organization called Mukhabarat, which is Iraqi intelligence. And he was Saddam's he's one of Saddam's closest military advisors. He was the head of the Iraqi intelligence service and secret police, the Mukhabarat. And it was his task to cripple the Kurdish resistance, as they saw it, by eradicating the civilian population. And his forces, they embarked on a systematic campaign, mass killings, and so-called population transfers and Arabization, in which thousands of, Kurdish people, also Assyrian people, who are actually linguistically closer to the Arabs, and some other groups like Turkmens and Yazidis and so on and so forth, were all, transported, if not killed, into southern Iraq to sort of rid that area of potential fifth columnists, as they would say.
So was this sort of like a concentration camp type of situation?
There was concentration camps, there was mass killings, there was mass graves, and some women and children were simply just moved to the south and resettled among populations there.
And Assyrians, are Assyrians, I guess, what you would, to oversimplify, you'd call them Canaanites if you were reading the Bible, like before Arabs were in that part of the world?
Well, I don't know if they're specifically Canaanites, but there was an Assyrian Empire, so these are also. Remember, I said there's 3 main groups linguistically: the Semitic groups, the European groups, and the Turkic groups.
Right.
So these are part of the Semitic group. So they're actually linguistically closer to the Arabs, but nevertheless, they're not. They are a subgroup and a minority, and they were also, thrown into the lot here. And there is a quote from Chemical Ali, which says, this was an actual order that he gave to the army in 1988. It says, within your jurisdiction, the armed forces must kill any human being or animal present in these areas. It was that comprehensive. So by 1988, some 4,000 villages had been destroyed, and an estimated 180,000 Kurds had been killed, and some 1.5 million had been deported. And this, of course, included, like I said before, the famous chemical attack on the village of Halabja near the Iranian border, which I think was the same year, if I remember correctly. So that was the Anfal campaign committed against the Kurds. I could talk about, so what's the situation of the Kurds, in my view, more recently?
Yeah, I think we should, because, the Kurds are I think most Americans know about them from the two conflicts in Iraq, but there's issues with Turkey and everything that involves NATO and Turkey. There's always a Kurdish issue. There's Kurds in Syria that are sort of stuck in the Syrian civil war, and as well as Iraq and Iran, and the United States has complex relationships with all of those places, to say the least. And the Kurds,
say the least. Yes.
the Kurds sort of are like, they want to stay friendly with the United States, but the United States hasn't always been that great a friend, but maybe we're the best one they've got. I'll let you describe it.
You're not wrong about this. In fact, I don't know, maybe the expression redheaded stepchild or something. They feel like they've been used and abused. Yeah, so you're right about, in fact, I'll go through each of these sort of 3 or 4 countries and very quickly where they stand in each of these countries right now. Because remember, a Kurd in Turkey is national, in terms of nationality, he's Turkish.
Sure.
But ethnically he's Kurdish, or linguistically, and so on and so forth. It's a little different in Iraq, I'll get to that. So in Turkey, it's always been fairly bad for the Kurds. Both under the secularist, nationalist Kemalists from Ataturk's days, and also under the more kind of Islamist Erdogan regime. The Kurds have not done too well under either of those two very opposed ideologies. Öcalan, the head of the PKK, PKK is considered a terrorist group by the Turkish government, and it has done terrorist things, actually, but they would consider themselves a separatist group. But it depends who you ask, right?
Right.
So Öcalan has been in prison for years, and many, many, many Turkish activists, including the famous female activist Leyla Zana, have historically been jailed and persecuted in Turkey for speaking Kurdish, for celebrating Kurdish or Iranic New Year's like Nowruz. In fact, although it's gotten somewhat better recently because Turkey has tried to comply to some extent with EU regulations in its bid to try to join the EU, which hasn't gone anywhere. But many Turks still deny the fact that there are Kurds in Turkey, even though by most independent accounts they're about 30% of the population.
Oh.
And they say they're mountain Turks.
Right.
Right. Although clearly, ethnically and linguistically, these are different categories of language, but that's politics.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in reality, not to get nationalistic about it myself, but if you want to be realistic about it, the Kurds or the Iranics have been in that region for thousands of years, and the Turkic-speaking peoples came in the 7th century AD. So, they're both old, but one is much older than the other.
Right. I guess in some fairness to the Turks, I guess trying to call people mountain Turks is better than trying to eradicate them.
Absolutely. Call me anything you want. And there's been some attempts at that, there too. There's been incredible repression, but not to the extent of what Iraq did during the Anfal campaign, for sure.
Right.
Now, in Syria, it's a smaller number of Kurds than either in Turkey or in Iraq or in Iran, but they don't have any friends there either. They are fighting the actual regime, the official regime of Bashar al-Assad, and they are also fighting the occupation force of Turks that are occupying northern Syria. Who certainly don't want the Kurds to get a foothold in Syria and then encourage their own Kurds across the border.
Right.
And they're also fighting the remnants of ISIS. Now, the U.S. and Israel have given them some backing intermittently, depending on whether, but they feel like they're being used as pawns. That's always taken away when it's necessary in the larger geopolitics of the region. and neither Israel or the U.S. wants the Kurds to have their independent country there. They just want to use them as thorns in the sides of their enemies. That's the feeling the Kurds have, and I think they're correct. In Iraq, ironically, where the Anfal campaign happened, is where the Kurds are doing the best today, I would say. Today, they have survived those brutal days, and after the fall of Saddam Hussein, I guess if you could say there's any silver lining to the American invasion of Iraq, is that the Kurds are doing much better, as are the Shiites in the south, those Marsh Arabs being included in that. And they have basically a de facto, if not official, country for themselves in the Kurdish Autonomous Zone, or Governorate, of northern Iraq. And they're democratic. They have elections. Women have freedom. Kurdish people have never been strict Muslims in the sense that they enforce the Sharia like a lot of their neighbors. They're much more sort of almost pagan people. Mm-hmm. Probably goes back to that Iranic tradition. And economically, they're doing relatively well. There's a lot of investment in the Kurdish areas of Iraq. They had a lot of trouble with ISIS a few years ago, but they beat them back, ironically with the help of Iran and the U.S., two avowed enemies, but they cooperated when it came to ISIS.
Right.
Which I think everybody was afraid that those monsters were, another level of bad. So they have beaten that back relatively successfully, although they took some bruises for sure. And they are living as part of Iraq, but in a semi-independent manner. And there's a growing movement trying to push for Iraqi Kurdistan to actually become its own nation. Now, go ahead. It seemed like you wanted to say something.
You're right, but I'm sure that you can almost anticipate the questions. And one is, I'm how's that being received internally in Iraq? But even the one before that, is, I guess there's more than one, but how the neighboring countries with, let's just in air quotes, a Kurdish problem might welcome that, then that the Kurds could all go to Kurdish Iraq or Kurdistan, whatever we want to call it. But the Iraqis may not want an influx of, the entire Kurdish diaspora, and the people who live in those countries who have lives there may not want to pick up and leave, just because their ethnicity has a state. So you can dissect that any way you like.
It's very complicated. Those are great questions, and there's no simple answer to them because it's convoluted and it's complicated. Each of the countries that we've mentioned have different agendas. The Kurds themselves, like I said, there's 3 or 4 languages that call themselves Kurdish. They don't get along themselves with, politically. A Kurd in Turkey and a Kurd in Syria and a Kurd in Iran may all be called Kurds, but if it comes down to the brass tacks, they don't agree on much. And so it's difficult and complicated. I'll tell you, the Turkish government has many times threatened Iraq with invasion if they allow a Kurdish state to form. Because, again, they don't want their own Kurds to get the same idea or want to join. Right. In fact, their own Kurdish population is bordering Iraqi Kurdistan, so they would naturally join together.
Right.
Now, the Iraqi government, oftentimes they ally with each other, with the Arabs and the other groups. The Shiites and the Sunnis. The Arabs are divided into 2 confessional denominations. The Shiites, who are closer to Iran, and the Sunnis, who are closer to the Arab states. And ironically, the Kurds, who are ethnically closer to Iran, are Sunnis, which Iran is not. So do you see the complexity here?
Right. They're allies of convenience, but there's really nothing else in common.
That's right. There's cultural similarity, there's linguistic similarity, but Iran is mostly Sunni, and even though it shares ethnicity and language with the Kurds, they are so it depends who's ruling these countries, right? So if Iran were to suddenly become a monarchy again or a secular democracy, they would probably support the Kurds much more. But today, because it's run by a theocracy that's very much identifying itself with Shiism, they're not that into the Kurds, even though they share an ethnicity and language, because it's not the same religion.
Right.
They care about religion. So they care more about that. So it really depends on who's in charge of the countries, and that might change at any moment. And that actually takes us to Iran. And it's a very complex situation because Iran is different than the other countries because Kurds are Iranic. But they're still a very specific type of Iranic, right? Just because they're Iranic doesn't mean that they don't want their independence even in Iran.
Right.
In fact, there have been independent Kurdish movements in Iran both before and after the revolution, even during the Shah's time. So the fact that they are linguistically and culturally and ethnically closer to the Iranians does not necessarily mean that they want to join Iran or not have their own independent Kurdistan even within Iran. They haven't been persecuted to the extent they have in the Arab countries or in Turkey, but it's not an ideal situation for them there either. Let's put it that way. And in fact, we saw an example of that last year. What triggered the latest protests in Iran last year started with the killing or the death while she was in custody of Mahsa Amini, who was a Kurdish Iranian.
Right.
Right. Now, a lot of Iranians don't want to play that up because they don't want to like make this into an ethnic thing.
Right.
Because everyone joined those demonstrations across Iran, and they took off, and it became anti-government, anti-theocracy. But it is true that some of the separatist Kurds see it not just against the government, but as also a manifestation of their desire for independence.
Right. It's an opportunity for nationalism, which may or may not be counterproductive to their allies.
Absolutely. So it's complicated, but the Iranians may actually end up being the natural power brokers here, because as a nation, Iran would have an ethnically motivated interest. It has to make a decision. In fact, I wrote about this a little while back in a piece I published about Syria and Iraq, and the Kurds were part of this, that Iran would have an interest. It has a fear and a hope. The fear is losing its own Kurdistan, right? But the hope is, if it plays its cards right, it will gain all these other Kurdistans who, if they see themselves as Iranics,
right,
and if they see Iran as their ally, right? Which Iran has sometimes been and sometimes not been. And so Iran has to make a decision regarding the Kurds as to, the way I put it in the article was whether it fears losing a daughter or wants to gain a bunch of daughter-in-laws.
Right.
Right.
And the dowries of their fathers and mothers.
Exactly. Right. So that's the situation of the Kurds today. I think the only other thing we can, if you want to talk about, is, how it was that I transitioned from that and whether I'm still involved with the issue at all after leaving IMI.
Well, how could I
go that direction yet?
How could I say no? I mean, yeah, we have some more time, so yeah. Why don't you tell us about that transition and if you're still involved?
Yeah. So the Linden Productions was I haven't mentioned that. IMI, I should say, where my work with the Kurdish issue began, also had a side hustle, you could say. It had a documentary wing called Linden Productions, right? Which had been a part of Lorimar in the past, so on and so forth. And so, although the visual evidence for the war crimes tribunals was all very kind of secretive in a way, the documentary wing was not. In fact, we got a lot of publicity. We had a People magazine kind of write up on us. We had ABC World News Tonight did a segment on us. It's LA. And so Linden Productions did some documentaries, which I did some research for child soldiers, about child soldiers, something called The World's Youngest Warrior, World's Most Wanted Man, about Karadzik, who I mentioned before.
Right.
And my role was as researcher. And so having that kind of background and resume sort of made me somewhat attractive to more commercial production houses here in LA. And they brought me on board, headhunted me away to do a show called The Secret Missions of the CIA for History Channel. And then from there, they sort of became more and more commercial. Trio, CBS, something called American Fighter Pilot, which was about the real life Top Gun school, so on and so forth. World of Wonder, Weller Grossman. And one show that I worked on that fully sort of took me away from the politics side, but still in history, but I regret to this day, I have to say, and I'll go ahead and name names here, was a show called The Kings. They brought me on board because of my background and said, why don't you do the research and help write a first draft for a show about the history of Mesopotamia.
Okay.
And I thought, how wonderful. I was excited to do that. I knew enough, having done the research, to do that. But unfortunately, someone else came in and completely rewrote that show into an atrocity, what I would call a racist atrocity, that was really meant to, as a piece of propaganda, to prepare the American populace for the invasion of Iraq.
Oh, okay.
Saying that it's been nothing but one dictator after another in hope and in waiting of a liberator. And 2 weeks later, we invaded Iraq. Yeah, so I took my name off of that show and transitioned to what you originally knew me as, which is an animation producer.
Right. Well, you deserve a break. You deserve a mental health vacation.
Yeah. So, in that world of documentaries, my role had been researcher, associate producer, segment producer, this kind of field producer, these kind of various titles and roles. And then I moved and transitioned to feature animation, worked with a guy named Max Howard, who'd been president of feature animation at Warner Brothers. We made 3 films independently. Worked with the famous Weinsteins, infamous, I should say now, so on and so forth. And it took me an entirely different direction, a little bit more money, although not always. Sometimes we lost money, but certainly a whole different world. I think if I had wanted to continue in the previous world, I would have needed to move to DC or New York, where a lot more of this sort of NGO stuff happens than in Los Angeles. But in terms of, am I still involved with it? I would say just tangentially in a couple of ways. First of all, as you know, you're a member of my Facebook community, Ariana, which regularly posts about the culture and history of the Iranic peoples, the Persianate peoples, and including quite a lot on the Kurds, both their ancient history with the Medes, and every once in a while some articles and posts about how they're doing today, and on the intermittent Persian version as well. And I also did write an article that I published a couple years back that had a good segment on their situation today, and it was called Of Memory and Maps. And it was really about Syria and Iraq as a whole, but there was a good section on the situation of the Kurdish people within those two countries, closer to the present.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure someone out there is going to ask him to make predictions, but I'm not going to, because it's impossible. There's too many moving pieces for anyone to make any sort of prediction, and something that happens in one country could derail what happens in another country, and then probably within the countries themselves, and with the as you said, there's factions within the factions within the factions. It's just a story to watch.
I'll tell you, Jeff. My own personal wish and hope would be that the entire region becomes more federalized, where the small groups get their ability to maintain their own traditions, but like a Europe, they don't have to fight about it. That there's larger set of values to which they all must attend. I'm not sure how realistic that is, but one can always hope. If you'd like, as an ending for this, I have a couple of lines picked out from that article about the Kurds that I could mention, unless you have other questions that you want to throw at me prior to that.
I do not. I mean, every now and then, like, when I was a kid, I used to have these, thoughts that seemed like they were bright to me, and they of course weren't. And as an adult, you realize they weren't. But, every now and then you think there's parts of the world that would really benefit from having an infusion of, 20 or 30 million, like, hardworking, industrious, battle-hardened, peoples who have survived everything, but nobody takes 30 million people. I mean, it's just not.
Let me jump in on that a little bit. I mean, there is quite a lot of Kurdish population in Northwest Europe today. Not the numbers you're talking about, but in Germany and Sweden, so there's a large Kurdish population, and they're doing quite well. They're minorities, they're first generation. There's a language problem, there's cultural problems, there's religious differences, but they're actually doing relatively well. But especially first and second generation minorities, they're still thinking about Kurdistan, right? And so we'll see what happens. I think where they're doing the best is actually in northern Iraq, and hopefully, if in Iran, if this tyrannous theocracy falls, then they'll be doing better there as well. I'm still more concerned for them in Turkey and in places like Syria, because simply the level of chaos is so great. We don't know what's going to happen in Syria. So we'll have to see. But there's an old expression. Maybe I'll just end with this. It's not. I didn't make it up. It's a famous Kurdish saying, and it says, "The only friend of the Kurd is the mountain."
I think the Afghans might have used the same line.
Yeah. They're related peoples, by the way.
Yeah, I know. What were the lines that you wrote that you wanted to use? Because I have a feeling
I think that was it. Actually, something about the Kurds are, they're the longest suffering and largest stateless ethnicity, as many of us have heard, in the region. They've survived near continuous repression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, attempted genocide. And what is certain is that the Kurds will continue to remember their genocides and their oppression. And they'll remember the empty promises of fickle or fleeting friends. So I wish them well, but again, for now, I'm afraid that the most apropos line is that famous lament. We shall see. I wish them the best, for sure, particularly in Iraq. We'll continue to follow, but as for predictions, you're absolutely right. It's too complicated to say. Maybe we can predict the situation of the Kurds in a more specific region, such as northern Iraq. But in terms of more generally in the region, we're talking about multiple countries with multiple ethnicities, identities, and trajectories. And so it's very hard to say. It's just, I have no answers except good wishes.
I think that's fair enough. All right. Were there any socials or places where people can follow you or et cetera that we didn't mention?
Plenty. You know those, John.
Yeah,
so, yeah, sure. Well, my name is Darius Kamali, Kamali. So if they simply Google me, they'll find a lot. The two socials, particularly that have to do with the Kurds to some extent, are the Ariana group on Facebook, which you were nice enough to mention at the beginning, which often has not so much about the politics, but the art and culture of the Kurdish people, both ancient and medieval and modern. And the Persian version podcast as well. And so those two are plenty to get you started for those interested in in not just stuff that I do, but those things that are particularly related to the Kurdish people.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time and your expertise on a pretty difficult and very complex subject. And thank you all for listening. And hopefully you'll check out all of Darius's stuff, his work, his group, his podcast, and and hopefully you'll give it a nice rating and a review. And hopefully you'll do the same for ours and like and subscribe both. And more importantly than any of those things is to refer it to friends and family who you think might be interested. So once again, I thank you for listening, and you'll hear from us again next time in Garden Views.
Thank you, Jeff. Always good to be with you.
Likewise. Thank you for being a part of the show.
Yeah, they smiling in your face. Behind your back, all they got for you is hate. Yeah, they smiling in your face. Behind your back, yo, they wanna take your place. Just smiling in your face. Behind your back, all they got for you is hate. Just smiling in your face. Yeah, they smiling in your face. Funny how the time changed, strain some relationships. Turn your back for a second and they done flip the script. Oh yeah, they love it when you're down on your luck, then reappear when they need you and be all in your ear. Like, oh, but you listen so well, feel like I could tell you anything. Let me drain you empty with this energy. Like I ain't dealing with shit, dodging rumors. I know two that came from you, cause you the only one I talk to. Superficial bitches that be creating the issues I just ain't got time to listen to. See me in my weakness, say you'll keep my secrets, then betray me without thinking. Then you call me fan without understanding the meaning. If I ain't love your mother, would've been said fuck off. Giving you the benefit, you hit me with the gloves off. I should've known you was a whole ass faker when I first saw the hatred. Shit caught me with the bait and switch. Friends like these, no need for enemies. Always with a trick up they sleeve, just like a fiend. They backstabbers, whatever's yours is what they after. They see you when you shine and wanna try to dim the light. They all smiles when you around. When you leave, they drag your name on the ground. Make me wanna holler, how could I have missed it? You on that pretend shit, fuck out of here. This ain't a friendship, this ain't a friendship.
You ain't a genuine friend when you keep truth hiding. And it's a shame that when you smiling, it's two-sided. Like quarters and nickels, supporting my niggas. When I was floor sweeping poor before your boy could get listens. You distorted the images of the much shares. Now I'm simply pouring out liquor for the friendship we once shared. I know you kind know, lying with no control. Waiting for the moment to stick a knife in my spine slow. Holding a convo with you's like wearing blindfolds. And broadcasting my secrets to every John Doe. You're ruthless, I used to trust you, the truth is. Fuck you, I trust you as far as I can shoot this. I'm even pissed at the people that introduced us. Cause now they co-sign means nothing to me, it's useless. See, friends will walk through fire and something bad happens. But it's no respect for them dag-nabbit backstabbers.
With friends like these, no need for enemies. Always with a trick up they sleeve, just like a fiend. They backstabbers, whatever's yours is what they after. They see you when you shine and wanna try to dim the light. They all smiles when you around. When you leave, they drag your name on the ground. Make me wanna holler, how could I have missed it? You on that pretend shit, fuck out of here. This ain't a friendship, this ain't a friendship.